The 19th century Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin was not just an armchair philosopher. He liked to be in the midst of the action. Bakunin participated in the 1848 uprising in Prague and the May 1849 uprising in Dresden, before being imprisoned and living in exile in Siberia. Prison conditions were bad enough that Bakunin lost his teeth due to scurvy. Only after many years was he able to escape and restart his revolutionary activities. But Bakunin was not only on the front lines. He also wrote numerous tracts, one of the most famous being God and the State, a text that he composed in February and March of 1871, just before the Paris Commune, an unsuccessful uprising that was short and bloody. God and the State was intended to be part of a larger work called The Nauto-Germanic Empire and the Social Revolution. But Bakunin did not finish the project, and it was only in 1882, 6 years after Bakunin's death, that some of his followers published God and the State as an independent work. God and the State is not the most polished text, and even Bakunin admits early on that he has a tendency to digress. But the book has roughly two main lines of argument. The first is pretty straightforward. Religion and the state are both bad. Christianity is ridiculous, and kings and emperors wrongly use religion to justify their abuses of power. The second argument is more subtle and is in fact what Bakunin starts with. He asks the question, who are right, the idealists or the materialists? Should we side with those who start with ideas, ideology, spirituality, and so on, or should we adopt a thoroughly materialistic approach that starts with matter, with the physical universe? Bakunin will end up arguing that the materialists are right, but he stresses that the initial contrast is too simplistic. After all, materialists do eventually arrive at ideas and abstractions. Now that we know the basic arguments, let's look at each of them in turn. First, religion. Bakunin provides scathing descriptions of Christianity and Judaism. He writes that the Jehovah of the Jews was of all the gods, quote, the most jealous, the most vain, the most ferocious, the most unjust, the most bloodthirsty, the most despotic, and the most hostile to human dignity and liberty. Bakunin adds that the tree of good and evil was God's way of ensuring that humans would remain his slaves. Meanwhile, the devil is the eternal rebel, the first free thinker, and the emancipator of worlds. Bakunin also has no patience for those who would see some practical value in religion. He quotes Voltaire, who said, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." To this he responds, "I reverse the phrase of Voltaire and say that if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him." For Bakunin, religion is inherently evil. But why do some people believe in God? Bakunin provides various possibilities, including general ignorance and lack of education, poverty and economic deprivation, and the need of the ruling class to stay in power, causing them to pretend to believe. Another reason why some people believe is that religion is a very old thing. But that's not a good reason, especially since science keeps correcting errors. Think of Copernicus and Galileo. Plus, people used to believe in slavery and cannibalism. Ironically, Bakunin fails to note here that it was especially Christianity that led to the abolition of slavery. Now, whereas religion is based on ignorance, Bakunin argues that the law of history is a progressive negation of what came before. We progress from animal slavery to being slaves to God to enjoying complete liberty and humanity. You can probably tell from all this talk of negations that Bakunin is a great fan of the philosopher Hegel. Bakunin also sees Christianity as involving a radical negation. For the believer, God being everything, the real world and man are nothing. God being truth, justice, goodness, beauty, power, and life, man is falsehood, iniquity, evil, ugliness, impotence, and death. God being master, man is the slave. To believe in God, you have to negate yourself. This rather stereotypical criticism of religion is of course based on a radical dualism. When humans invent God, they supposedly do so by emptying themselves of all that is positive, ascribing these characteristics instead to God. All religions are therefore cruel since they rely on sacrifice. God is good, whereas you are evil. God is Lord, you are slave. Few religious people would agree with this simplistic description, I certainly don't, but it makes for effective rhetoric. Now that we know Bakunin's view of religion, his view of the state is easy to sum up. Bakunin concludes that the ruling classes of Europe, the William I of Germany, the Napoleon IIIs of France, the Alexanders of Russia, all of them act as if they rule by divine appointment. But all leaders only want to enslave their subjects. Bakunin writes, "Beware of shears, for where there is a flock, there necessarily must be shepherds also to shear and devour it." The only course of action, then, is revolution. There is no point in siding with parliamentary socialists who try to make incremental gains. It is all or nothing. As mentioned, Bakunin's view of God and the state is connected with a related argument about idealism and materialism. Bakunin is particularly suspicious of one group of idealists, the deists, people who treat God as a very distant figure who set the universe in motion but now remains remote and uninvolved. Bakunin writes that for the deists, God is merely a, quote, nebulous, diaphanous, illusory being. The idealists content themselves with saying God and nothing more. But these idealists do use this distant God to teach morality, to tell people to obey the state, and so on. Bakunin despises all such hollow religiosity. Another problem with the idealists is that they begin with an idea with God, and then they act as if there is a terrible fall from the sublime heights of the eternal idea into the mire of the material world, from absolute perfection into absolute imperfection, from thought to being, or rather from supreme being to nothing. Here again we see how Bakunin can only view Christianity as a form of dualism. God is good, creation is evil, which is of course a straw man argument. But he is entitled to be skeptical of religious arguments that overcome the divide between the material and the divine by appealing to absurdity, in the famous phrase, credo quia absurdum. Even a Christian would agree with Bakunin that faith is not easy for everyone to accept. Interestingly, Bakunin argues that an obsessive idealism always ends paradoxically in a brutal materialism. The divine evaporates and rises to its own country, heaven, while the brutal alone remains actually on earth. One example, the Roman Catholic Church, which is supposedly focused on divine matters, but, according to Bakunin, is actually obsessed with earthly power and possessions. Another example, ancient Rome, which lauded abstractions and ideals, liberty, laws, the state, but was in reality brutal in its conquests and enslavements. By contrast, Greece, which was also based on slavery and exclusive nationalism, nevertheless came closer to realizing the idea of humanity and emancipation. It is therefore better to be a materialist, as you can still end up with ideals and abstractions, but always in a more humane way. Having seen how Bakunin describes God and the state and critiques the idealists, we now come to his history of religion. Bakunin argues that religion started with fetishism, with external images. Soon we get hierarchy, as some people are said to be more inspired than others. Finally, Christianity eventually came on the scene as the result of 4 factors. First, we need the personal Jewish God. We need monotheism and egotism. Second, we need a belief in a universal humanity that transcends a specific nation like the Jews. It was the Roman Empire that enabled this vision of the universal. Third, we need a more metaphysical understanding of God as the One, as a more abstract idea. It was the Greeks who provided this. And then finally, we need to make this abstract God more personal. This is how we get Christ and the Incarnation. The idea enters into the world of matter. For Bakunin, the last step is particularly absurd, which is why he argues that Christianity only grew because it appealed to women and slaves, the 2 most oppressed, most suffering, and naturally also the most ignorant classes of the ancient world. In recounting the history of religion, Bakunin then skips to his own day and age. He argues that Christianity lives on when thinkers like Rousseau and Robespierre and Victor Hugo, figures who seem progressive, nevertheless espouse deist ideas. We see something similar in the world of politics. Most people are fine with having a constitutional monarch where there is the appearance of liberalism and democracy, as the king has less power than before, but where people, according to Bakunin, are still enslaved. This is how the bourgeoisie manages to hold on to its power. The constitutional monarch is therefore like the deist god, more remote and distant, more abstract, but still invoked in order to guarantee the power of the state. That's why Bakunin concludes there cannot be a state without religion. The two go hand in hand. Finally, while Bakunin is quite happy to criticize religion in the most unsparing language, he does want to be nuanced about one thing, and that is the subject of authority. Anarchists are often said to dismiss all forms of authority, but Bakunin wants to clarify that this is not the case. Bakunin suggests that some types of authority do make sense. These include natural laws, the expertise of professionals like a bootmaker who fixes my shoe, science, and so on. For example, he says about natural laws, like gravity, yes, we are absolute slaves of these laws, but in such slavery there is no humiliation, or rather, it is not slavery at all. Interestingly, Bakunin cannot see that in religion, service is also considered freedom, as religious people want to obey what they perceive as good. But Bakunin does add that most forms of authority must constantly be questioned. That is why we can never trust scientists to run the state. Communism would be a terrible idea, and treating government as a science will lead to horrendous social experiments. Bakunin writes with uncanny foresight about the social scientists of the totalitarian governments of the 20th century. If they cannot perform experiments upon the bodies of individuals, they will ask nothing better than to perform them on the social body, and that is what must be absolutely prevented. In the end, then, while some forms of authority are good, we would be better off without God and the state. That is why Bakunin was an anarchist and a revolutionary.